Something that used to be a normal part of American life has quietly become one of the hardest things to achieve. Finding a stable, affordable place to live, whether renting or owning, now feels out of reach for millions of people who are doing everything right. This video is about what changed, why it happened, and what everyday Americans can actually do about it. Think about the last time you looked at rent prices in your area, or checked what homes are selling for in your neighborhood. Maybe you did it out of curiosity. Maybe you did it because you are actively searching. Either way, there is a good chance the numbers stopped you cold. A monthly rent that used to be manageable now takes up a much larger portion of a household's income. A starter home that a working family could have reasonably saved toward a decade ago now sits at a price point that feels almost impossible to reach. And the gap between what people earn and what housing costs has been widening steadily. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently and without much relief. That feeling of being priced out, of watching a basic human need become a financial stretch, is not a personal failing. It is a structural reality that millions of American households are navigating right now. And understanding what created it is the first step toward navigating it with clarity rather than frustration. Not long ago, buying a home felt like a realistic goal for a working American family. You saved for a few years, qualified for a mortgage, found something modest in a decent neighborhood, and built from there. That path still exists, but it has become significantly narrower for a growing number of people. And to understand why, we need to look at what has actually changed in the housing market over the past several years. The first shift is supply. Simply put, America has not been building enough homes to keep up with the number of people who need them. For years following the 2008 housing crisis, construction slowed dramatically. Builders became cautious. Lending became tighter. And the pace of new home building never fully recovered to where it needed to be. The result is a shortage, not everywhere equally, but broadly across many of the markets where people most need and want to live. The second shift is demand. The largest generation in American history reached prime home buying age right at the moment when supply was already strained. Millions of households were looking to buy at the same time. And when demand is high and supply is low, prices rise. That is not a political statement. It is simply how markets work. And in the housing market, that dynamic pushed prices upward in ways that outpaced wage growth in most parts of the country. Then came the change in borrowing costs. For many years, mortgage rates sat at historically low levels. Monthly payments on even a modestly priced home were manageable for middle-income households. But when rates rose, and they rose significantly in a relatively short period of time, the monthly cost of buying that same home jumped substantially. A house that was financially within reach at a low rate became genuinely unaffordable at a higher one. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of households who had been on the edge of qualifying found themselves priced out. The rental market absorbed much of that overflow. People who could no longer afford to buy stayed renting longer. That increased competition for rental units. And landlords, facing their own higher costs, raised rents in response. So the pressure did not stay contained in the ownership market. It spread directly into the rental market that lower and middle-income households depend on most. This is the landscape that emerged. Not from any single decision or event, but from a combination of long-building forces that converged at the same moment and landed heaviest on the households least equipped to absorb them. Understanding the market forces behind rising housing costs is one thing. But what does this actually feel like inside a real American household? What does it look like on a Tuesday evening when you are sitting at the kitchen table trying to make the numbers work? For many families, it starts with the budget. Housing costs, whether rent or a mortgage payment, are typically the single largest line item in a household's monthly expenses. When that number grows faster than income, everything else gets compressed. The grocery budget tightens. The car repair gets delayed. The family vacation becomes a weekend trip. The small financial cushion that used to exist between income and expenses quietly disappears. And once that cushion is gone, any unexpected expense, a medical bill, a broken appliance, a week of missed work, becomes a genuine crisis rather than a manageable inconvenience. For renters, the pressure is particularly direct. A lease renewal letter arrives with a rent increase. The options are limited. Absorb the increase by cutting elsewhere. Look for something cheaper in an area where cheaper options are increasingly scarce, or move further out. Many households are choosing that third option. They are moving further from city centers, further from job hubs, further from the schools and communities they built their lives around. Not because they want to, but because the math leaves them no other choice. And moving further out means longer commutes. More fuel costs. More time away from family. A trade-off that improves one number on the budget while quietly degrading the quality of daily life in ways that are harder to quantify. For households trying to transition from renting to owning, the challenge is layered. The down payment alone, even on a modestly priced home, represents years of disciplined saving for a median income household. And saving that aggressively while simultaneously paying high rent is a genuine contradiction. The very cost of renting makes it harder to save enough to stop renting. Many households find themselves running in place, putting money towards someone else's equity month after month while their own path to ownership keeps moving further into the future. Living arrangements are changing as a result. Adult children are staying in family homes longer. Multiple generations are sharing housing under one roof, not by preference, but by financial necessity. Roommate arrangements that people expected to leave behind in their 20s are extending into their 30s. These are not failures of ambition or effort. They are rational adaptations to a housing market that has moved faster than the households trying to navigate it. And underneath all of these practical adjustments is an emotional weight. Housing is not just a financial transaction. It is stability. It is the place your children grow up. It is the foundation from which everything else in a family's life is built. When that foundation feels unstable or perpetually out of reach, the stress does not stay contained to the housing conversation. It touches everything. When people talk about the housing market, the conversation often fills up quickly with terms and statistics that feel abstract and disconnected from real life. Median home prices, interest rate basis points, housing starts, vacancy rates. These are real measurements of real things, but they can make a genuinely human problem feel like a technical one. So let's step back from the jargon and look at what the underlying numbers are actually telling us in plain English. The most fundamental reality is a supply and demand imbalance. There are more households looking for housing than there are available units to house them. That gap did not appear overnight. It built up over more than a decade of underbuilding following the 2008 housing crisis, and it has not been closed. When demand consistently exceeds supply in any market, prices rise. In the housing market, those rising prices show up as higher home sale prices, higher rents, and lower vacancy rates, meaning fewer empty units available at any given time for people who need them. The affordability gap is the second number worth understanding. Affordability in housing is typically measured by looking at what percentage of a household's monthly income goes toward housing costs. For generations, the general guideline was that housing should consume no more than roughly 30% of monthly income. That benchmark is now out of reach for a growing share of American renters and buyers. In many markets, particularly in and around major cities, households are spending significantly more than that just to maintain their current housing situation. Every dollar above that threshold is a dollar taken directly from groceries, healthcare, savings, and every other category of household spending. Wage growth is the third piece of this puzzle. Wages have risen in recent years for many American workers. But in most markets, housing costs have risen faster. The result is that even households with growing incomes are falling further behind in relative terms when it comes to housing affordability. The paycheck is larger, but the gap between the paycheck and the monthly housing cost is also larger. Progress in one area is being quietly erased by faster movement in another. Mortgage rates add another layer to the ownership side of this equation. The monthly payment on a home purchase is determined not just by the price of the home, but by the interest rate on the loan. When rates are low, a household can afford a more expensive home for the same monthly payment. When rates rise, that same monthly payment buys significantly less home. In practical terms, this means that many households who saved diligently and reached what they believed was their down payment goal found themselves effectively priced out again. Not because home prices moved, but because the cost of borrowing did. These numbers are not presented to discourage. They are presented to clarify. Because understanding the actual mechanics of why housing feels so difficult right now is more useful than simply feeling overwhelmed by it. And that clarity connects directly to the longer and quieter consequences that the housing squeeze is producing inside American families over time. The pressures we have described so far, the supply shortage, the affordability gap, the rising rents and borrowing costs, these are immediate and visible. You feel them when the rent increase notice arrives. You feel them when the mortgage calculator produces a monthly payment that doesn't fit your budget. But there is a slower, quieter layer of consequence that deserves equal attention. Effects that do not show up in a single month's budget, but accumulate over years and reshape the long-term financial health and emotional well-being of American families in ways that are much harder to reverse. The most significant of these is the widening wealth gap between those who own homes and those who do not. Homeownership has historically been the primary way that middle-income American families build wealth over time. A home purchased at a reasonable price and held over decades appreciates in value, builds equity, and eventually becomes an asset that can be passed down or drawn upon in retirement. For households locked out of ownership, either by price, by borrowing costs, or by the inability to save a down payment while paying high rent, that wealth-building engine simply does not exist. Every month of rent paid is a month of someone else's equity built. Over a decade, that gap compounds into a genuinely significant difference in net worth between owning and renting households at the same income level. The generational dimension of this is particularly important. Parents who were able to purchase homes during more affordable periods have an asset to draw on, to help adult children with down payments, to fund education, to provide a safety net during difficult times. Parents who were never able to build that equity have less to offer the next generation. Housing insecurity does not stay within one generation. It moves forward. It shapes what the next generation believes is financially possible for themselves and how much runway they have to build their own stability. Life milestones are shifting as a result. Marriage, children, and long-term community investment, decisions that previous generations made in their late 20s and early 30s, are being delayed by households that do not yet have stable housing as a foundation. This is not a cultural shift or a change in values. It is a practical response to financial reality. You build a life on stable ground. When the ground keeps moving, you wait. And waiting has its own costs, emotional, social, and financial, that compound quietly over time. Then there is the mental and physical toll of prolonged housing insecurity. Research consistently links housing instability with elevated stress, anxiety, and depression. The constant uncertainty of whether rent will be manageable at the next lease renewal, whether the landlord will sell, whether the neighborhood will remain affordable. This low-level chronic stress does not stay contained. It affects sleep. It affects parenting. It affects performance at work. It affects the quality of relationships. A household under sustained housing pressure is not just financially stretched. It is emotionally depleted in ways that ripple outward into every dimension of daily life. None of this is inevitable or permanent, but it requires honest acknowledgement, because the families living through this are not victims of their own poor decisions. They are navigating a structural reality that arrived faster than most of them could have prepared for. And that reality demands practical, grounded responses, not just from systems and markets, but from individual households making the best decisions they can with the information and resources available to them right now. It would be easy at this point to feel like the housing situation is something that simply happens to people, a force too large and too structural for any individual household to meaningfully influence. And in some ways, that feeling is understandable. The forces driving housing costs are real, and they are significant. But there are concrete, practical steps that individual households can take right now that genuinely improve their position. Not by solving the broader market, but by giving themselves more options, more clarity, and more resilience within it. The first step is understanding your true housing number. Most people think about housing costs in terms of rent or mortgage payment alone. But the real cost of housing includes much more than that single monthly figure. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance and repairs, utilities, HOA fees where applicable, and the cost of commuting from wherever you can afford to live. All of these are part of the true monthly cost of a housing decision. Renters have their own version of this calculation. Renter's insurance, utilities not included in rent, parking, and the cost of any services the building does not provide. Understanding your complete housing number, not just the headline rent or mortgage figure, gives you a much clearer picture of what you can genuinely afford and where the real trade-offs lie. Many households discover that a slightly higher rent in a location closer to work actually costs less in total when commuting expenses are factored in. Others discover that a home purchase that looks affordable on the surface becomes genuinely stretched when maintenance reserves and property taxes are added to the monthly calculation. This clarity is not just useful for budgeting. It is essential for making sound housing decisions that do not quietly destabilize the rest of your financial life over time. The second step is exploring every available path to stability, not just the traditional one. The traditional American housing path, rent until you save a down payment, buy a starter home, build equity, move up, is still a valid path. But it is no longer the only one worth considering, and for many households in many markets, it is not currently the most practical one. There are alternative approaches worth understanding honestly. In some markets, renting strategically, choosing location and flexibility over ownership, while investing the difference in savings and other assets can build wealth over time in ways that are genuinely competitive with homeownership, depending on local price-to-rent ratios. This is not settling. It is a calculated financial decision based on real numbers in your specific market. Smaller markets and secondary cities are worth serious consideration for households with location flexibility. Remote work has created genuine geographic freedom for a growing number of Americans. A household that can work from anywhere and chooses to live in a lower-cost market can dramatically improve their housing affordability without reducing their income. This is one of the most significant financial levers available to households with that flexibility, and it is one that many people underutilize simply because it requires rethinking deeply held assumptions about where life is supposed to happen. Co-ownership arrangements, purchasing property with a trusted family member or close friend, are another path that more Americans are beginning to explore seriously. Shared ownership reduces the individual down payment burden, splits maintenance costs, and makes ownership accessible at income levels where solo purchase would not be realistic. It requires careful legal structuring and honest conversation about expectations. But for the right households in the right relationships, it is a genuinely viable path to building equity that would otherwise remain out of reach. The third step is building toward ownership systematically, even if ownership feels distant right now. The biggest obstacle most renting households face on the path to ownership is the down payment. And the biggest obstacle to saving a down payment is the high cost of rent itself. This is a real and frustrating contradiction. But it does not make saving impossible. It makes saving intentional. Even a modest and consistent monthly contribution to a dedicated housing savings account, kept completely separate from everyday spending accounts, builds momentum over time. Automating that contribution so it moves before discretionary spending can absorb it is one of the most effective behavioral tools available. The amount matters less than the consistency and the separation. A small amount saved every month for several years becomes a meaningful sum. And a meaningful sum changes what is possible. Staying informed about first-time homebuyer assistance programs available at the state and local level is equally important. Many of these programs offer down payment assistance, favorable loan terms, or closing cost support for qualifying households. They are underutilized because they are not widely promoted and the application process can feel complicated. But for households that qualify, they can meaningfully reduce the barrier to entry and accelerate the timeline to ownership in ways that years of independent saving alone cannot. The goal of these 3 steps is not to guarantee a particular outcome in a market that no individual can control. The goal is to move from a reactive position, where housing decisions are driven entirely by what is immediately available and immediately affordable, toward a more intentional one where the household has a clear picture, realistic options, and a direction they are actively moving in. That shift from reactive to intentional is worth more in the long run than any single market condition. When you are living inside a housing market that feels impossible, when the rent keeps climbing and the ownership path keeps extending further into the future, it is very easy to conclude that this is simply the permanent new reality, that the window has closed, that the math will never work. But a longer view of American housing history tells a more nuanced and ultimately more grounding story. Housing markets move in cycles. They always have. Periods of rapid price growth are historically followed by periods of slower growth, stabilization, or gradual correction. The specific timing of those shifts is impossible to predict with precision. But the pattern itself is consistent across decades of American housing data. What feels permanent in the middle of a cycle rarely is. The market that exists today is not the market that will exist in 5 or 10 years. And the decisions made today, with clarity and intention, position a household to benefit from whatever that next shift brings. There are already signs of gradual change beginning to emerge in parts of the housing market. Construction activity has been increasing in some regions as builders respond to the demand signals the market has been sending. More housing units in the pipeline means more supply entering the market over the coming years. More supply does not immediately solve an affordability crisis, but it does change the direction of pressure. The force that has been pushing costs upward begins to ease when more units become available. Remote work has permanently expanded the geographic range of viable housing markets for a meaningful segment of the American workforce. This is a structural shift that was not present in previous housing cycles. It means that the pressure is not as uniformly concentrated as it once was. Households with location flexibility have genuine options that did not exist a generation ago. And as more households exercise that flexibility, the demand pressure on the most expensive markets gradually redistributes across a broader range of communities. It is also worth remembering that America has navigated housing challenges before. The post-World War II housing shortage was resolved through a massive expansion of construction. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s reshaped lending practices and eventually stabilized. The 2008 collapse was devastating for millions of households, but the market recovered, and a new generation of buyers eventually found their footing. Each of these periods felt permanent to the people living through them. None of them were. This does not minimize what households are experiencing right now. The difficulty is real. The financial strain is real. The delayed milestones and the compressed budgets and the emotional weight of housing insecurity. All of it is real and deserves honest acknowledgement. But real difficulty and permanent impossibility are not the same thing. And holding that distinction clearly in mind is part of what allows a household to keep making sound decisions in a difficult environment rather than giving up on a goal that remains genuinely worth working toward. The American housing market is under significant pressure, but it is not broken beyond repair. It is adjusting, slowly, imperfectly, unevenly, as markets always do. And the households that navigate this period most successfully will be the ones that stayed informed, stayed intentional, and kept moving in the right direction, even when the destination felt very far away. Housing in America is harder right now than it has been for a long time. If you have been feeling that in your monthly budget, in your lease renewal, in the gap between what you earn and what a stable home actually costs. You were not imagining it, and you were not alone in it. But difficulty is not the same as impossibility. You now understand what shifted in the housing market and why. You understand how those shifts ripple into daily life and long-term family finances. And you have 3 practical steps: understanding your true housing number, exploring every available path to stability, and building toward ownership systematically, that you can begin acting on right now regardless of where the broader market sits today. You do not need the market to cooperate to start making better decisions within it. You just need clarity, a realistic plan, and the willingness to move forward one small step at a time. If this kind of calm, honest breakdown of the forces shaping American economic life is useful to you, subscribe. Every week we take one of the big pressures that everyday Americans are navigating and break it down in plain English. No panic, no politics, just grounded, practical information that helps you make better decisions for your household and your future.